And so when the American Revolution was fought, and the sovereign citizens, who were the white male property owners at the time, they then held their property in allodium. They owned it free and clear and outright, and the king, the prior king, could no longer tax them. But neither could the governments that they created, neither the state or the federal governments. So long as property is held in allodium, there is no superior authority. And that's the principle upon which America was founded, so that free people, sovereign people, could live on a sovereign piece of property. Remember the old saying, a king or a queen, you're like a king or a queen in your own home. You've heard the phrase. Well, that's what they meant. They really meant it, quite literally. And being a sovereign meant that you had to act like one, a good one. Not a despot, but a good one. And a good sovereign is responsible for themselves and responsible for their family, responsible for their neighbors, and is respectful to their neighbors, and looks out after the greater community. That's what a good sovereign does. So the principle of sovereignty extends to our behaviors, to our values, to our virtues, to good Christian values as well. And so when the country was founded on those principles, and then those principles were embraced by the system of law and the constitutions that were created, both on the state level and the federal level. So, prior to the Constitution, there were sovereign states that were free and independent states, quite literally. That's what it said in the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The states were free and independent, and the people were sovereign within those states. The Constitution was created out of the sovereignty of the people to create this 14th entity, originally, the United States Corporation, which served as both a corporate enterprise and a national government. It was carved out of a piece of Virginia and the Virginia Company, in fact. There were two corporations that came here when the country was settled, the New England Corporation in the north and the Virginia Company in the south. And it was out of the Virginia Corporation that the United States Corporation was carved out of. Washington, D.C. was carved out of a prior corporation. It was deeded over and made into a separate jurisdiction and a separate country. So when the Constitution was created, there were then 14 countries here in the United States of America, the 13 colonies and the District of Columbia. And the Constitution, what it did was it put limitations upon that 14th country in relationship to the original 13 colonies and the sovereign people. It basically said, look, we're the sovereign people, okay? And these are the sovereign states. We're going to create, through the Constitution, a corporation and a national government to serve the sovereignty. And you have a very limited authority and limited jurisdiction. And anything that we don't spell out in this Constitution and say that you have the power and authority to do, we're going to reserve it to ourselves through the 9th and 10th Amendments. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says that the federal government has health care or education or agriculture or any of these other areas that they have encroached upon our lives. It doesn't spell it out there. Quite literally doesn't say anything about it. And so when the country was founded, it was for very, very limited jurisdiction. It was meant to be limited. And the Constitution was like a federal employee handbook, instructing the federal government what its job description was, and that it could not go beyond its job description, period. And so, the concept, which is a misconception that most Americans have, is that the Constitution gave you rights. Most people think the Constitution is what gave you rights. That's what they teach in school. They teach you that America started with the Constitution. They barely even talk about the Declaration of Independence anymore. They don't even mention it. They just believe that it started with the government, that the government suddenly is the sovereign power and the people aren't the sovereign power, which isn't true. The Constitution didn't give you any rights. You already had all the rights you could possibly use before the Constitution was created. You had unalienable rights. All the government can possibly give you are civil rights. But what the government can giveth you, the government can taketh away. And so it's not an unalienable right, which is one the government can't give you and can't take away. They're natural law, natural rights, common law. The right to walk, to breathe, to travel, to do commerce. All these derive from the common law. And no government can regulate those. That is a paramount distinction here, very important, between an unalienable right and a civil right. Because a sovereign citizen has unalienable rights, not constitutional rights. The most that a U.S. citizen can have are civil rights, which are rights given by the government. Most people aren't aware that U.S. citizens did not have a right to a trial by jury till 1967. If you're a U.S. citizen, you didn't have a right to a trial by jury till 1967. Well, that's strange. I always thought I had a right to a trial by jury. No, you don't. The sovereign people do. The sovereign people have the unalienable rights under the common law and the Bill of Rights, but the U.S. citizens do not. In fact, the U.S. citizens don't have a Constitution or a Bill of Rights at all. The only ones who have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights are the sovereign citizens. Because again, there's this relationship here. It was the sovereign people that created the Constitution. If there are no sovereign people, there is no Constitution. There is no Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is separate from the Constitution. The Constitution is a commercial contract between the states and this corporation. The Bill of Rights was a treaty between the corporation and the sovereign people. If there are no sovereign people, there's no treaty. There's no Bill of Rights. And so all that remains is, for most people, is to pay lip service to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And you hear people taunt them all the time. Oh, I've got this, I've got that. But really there isn't any, by law. And these have been adjudicated in the courts. These distinctions that I'm talking about. Who has a Bill of Rights, who doesn't. There are different rights and immunities for a sovereign citizen versus a U.S. citizen. So when was a U.S. citizen created? The U.S. citizen was created by the 14th Amendment in 1868, one of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. Now the Civil War was a pivotal point in American history. And most people believe today, as they're teaching, that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator and all that, it was all about freeing the slaves. That is what we are taught. And although the slaves were freed at the conclusion of the Civil War, it was not from some great ideological or moral purpose that they were freed. It was more of an economic sanction to cripple the South than it was some great moral and ethical purpose. The real purpose for the Civil War, the reason it was fought, it was over the issue of state sovereignty. That's why the Civil War was fought. It was fought because the South, who had not fared well under this constitutional contract, and the federal government that happened to be in place, and the European powers that were influencing the federal government and the industrial North, were preferential to the industries and the commerce of the North and deferential to the South. And so the South said, hey, we're getting the bad end of the deal here. We want to secede from this union. We want to revoke this contract that we created. The states created the Constitution, remember. They wanted to revoke the contract and secede from the union because it wasn't serving them any longer. And then the federal government and the European powers behind that in the North, of course, crushed the state sovereignty and the secession movement of the South. That was why the Civil War was fought. And from that point to the present time, there has been a continual assault upon the sovereignty of the states and the sovereignty of the citizens. And as time has progressed, more and more and more of the sovereign people have become U.S. citizens. More and more of the responsibilities of the states have been transferred to the federal United States, to that little area, that District of Columbia, that 14th country that was created, that only had jurisdiction within the 63 square miles of the District of Columbia, or an unincorporated territory, or any area that it had a federal area or a federal enclave. Any place there existed United States citizens, in fact. So the Constitution did not give you rights. You had rights prior to the Constitution. It simply restated what rights, the unalienable rights that the sovereign people had. The Constitution was a contract between the states and this new corporation, the United States Corporation. And so, from the point of the Civil War to the point of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which I'll talk about when I get into the economic section, there was a long duration of time between that and the Social Security Act. When the 14th Amendment was passed, it was passed for the newly freed black slaves. Because the country was racially divided during the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, and since the Civil War, around the issue of whether or not blacks were going to be given full sovereign rights. Citizenship was determined by the states, not by the federal government. Every state had and still has the power to naturalize citizens directly through the superior courts.